today I've got a very interesting interview with you. I am talking to Tim Ferriss, who is very well known initially for running the 4-Hour Workweek, but he's since expanded on that. He's written about the 4-Hour Body and now the 4-Hour Chef, and I like the way he talks about this trio of books. It's Benjamin Franklin's Healthy, Wealthy, Wise, isn't that it?
That's right, you got it.
Okay, so most people talk to you relevant to these kind of, life hacking things, business ideas, and so on. But today I want to focus almost entirely on language learning because what you've done in other areas is very impressive. But just looking at your background, it's very relevant to languages because you did your degree in East Asian Studies.
I did.
And your thesis was in neuroscience and unorthodox acquisition of Japanese by native English speakers, if I got that right. And just before you graduated, you were the curriculum designer at Berlitz International.
I worked on Japanese and English curriculum redesign. Yeah.
I actually worked for Berlitz myself too, but just as an English teacher. Okay, and from then you... before all this, you as a teenager, you had done a year abroad in Japan, and you kind of changed your language learning process over time. And I think if I've got this, you reached a certain stage that I want to ask you about. In Japanese in 1 year, Mandarin Chinese in 6 months, German in 3 months, and Spanish in 8 weeks. So we'll get into the meat of that very shortly, but. The first thing that I'm really curious is how did you get interested in Japanese in the first place? Because you as a teenager, you went to Japan, so obviously something kicked that off in advance before you went over there.
It was really simple. In my particular case, I'd concluded I was bad at languages after my Spanish experience in the few years prior to that. Because, like everyone, I shouldn't say everyone, but most people who go through the normal formal schooling approach couldn't string more than a few sentences together, certainly couldn't have a conversation. And I ended up switching to Japanese when I switched schools, and I had the opportunity to study other languages, and my thought was, well, if I'm going to be bad at languages no matter which one I choose, I might as well, number one, study something related to a culture that I'm fascinated by, so ninjas and all that stuff, right? Samurai, what have you. And secondly, that my friends were in, and one or two of my new friends at that school were in the Japanese class. So I jumped into Japanese, and I almost actually what people don't realize is it was sold or described in the course handbook as conversational Japanese, and so as soon as they started introducing hiragana and katakana, the two syllabaries, I was like, whoa, what is this? What is this nonsense? And so I had like two big meetings with my resident advisor, the Japanese teacher, because I was considering very seriously quitting Japanese on two different occasions because of the writing, which is hysterical looking back, because I was so phobic I was like, well, look, if I have trouble with Spanish, I don't want to do something that's already harder than Spanish plus all this crazy character stuff. But that's how the Japanese class came to be. And Mr. Shimano, who was the teacher, was great. He was actually very different from my previous Spanish teachers. So, for instance, anytime he could see our faces falling, we were having trouble with Japanese, he would say, okay, time out. And his English was still very Japanese English. He'd be like, all right, time out. Okay. And then he would say squirrel in English to make us laugh, because that is probably the hardest word possible for a Japanese person to say. So he'd go, okay, watch. And he'd go, squirr, squirr. And everyone would crack up, and the mood would improve, and then we'd continue with the lesson. And I think he understood really well that it's not just having the right method on paper. You need to deal with the psychological, emotional aspect of it. And
absolutely.
There are always going to be frustrations, as you know. So that's how the class came to be. And then at some point, I actually ended up doing quite well with it. And I think partially because the class was very frequently after sports, and I have some thoughts on how physical activity pairs with language learning really well. But I ended up progressing really quickly, and at one point he said, we have this sister program with Seikei University, or Seikei High School in this case, in Tokyo, would you like to be an exchange student? And it just came out of left field for me. And then I talked to my parents, and off I went for my first major overseas trip.
Excellent. And one thing I didn't know before, or I would have missed it in your previous books, is you said that you had actually spent 6 months at first in Japan, where you didn't feel you had made that much progress, and you were still very frustrated. And so, what happened to change this? Because the same thing happened to me. I actually, I don't have the same kind of background where I wasn't, I didn't have such a good language education at first, and I've got a degree in electronic engineering. But after graduation, I moved to Spain, and I lived in Spain for 6 months without actually learning Spanish to any kind of degree. So I know you said something similar to this. So what happened?
I think there are two things. So I don't have a lot of data to support this, but I do think the 6-month point, there's something like related to neuroplasticity about that 6-month point. There's something really unusual about it. But secondly, I gave up on trying to mimic what I'd done in school because it wasn't working. When I went to Seike, I remember the first day of classes. So I had been measured for my school uniform, looked like a West Point cadet, and went into the English department office because I was basically their pet for the year. And this guy came up to me and he goes, "Hi," and gives me this paper, and I was like, sorry, I can't read this. What does this say? And he's like, okay. Traditional Japanese, 古文、物理学、physics, okay. And then went through the whole list, and I was just puzzled by this. And it turned out that what I'd been told before I went, because I was very nervous, was don't worry, you'll have plenty of Japanese classes. Now, the lost in translation was that they were all regular high school Japanese classes. So I went to bookstores, I bought what I thought appeared to be Japanese textbooks like my Spanish textbooks had been, and it just didn't work at the end of the day. Whether I was bored by the material or the books themselves were a problem in the progression, either way it didn't work. And so around the 6-month point is when I really embraced judo textbooks and comic books. And I found that the judo textbooks, because I was interested in the subject matter, gave me the grammar, because the grammar transfers, of course, between subject matter. And I actually think electrical engineering would be really good training for languages, but that's, or at least as good as an East Asian Studies degree. But we can come back to that. But the comic books, so I have a little show and tell. The comic books turned into a real outlet for me because it's all dialogue. It's almost all dialogue. And not only is it almost all dialogue, but it doesn't try to be, it does not attempt to be formal. There is some formality, but it's mostly very informal. So for a high school kid, that was perfect. And so here's one example. This is One Piece, the comic One Piece. I have now you'll notice the covers are the same. So once I did that in Japanese, this is One Piece in German and One Piece in Spanish. And it's a very popular series, so I was able to get it in every language. But the main difference was focusing on native materials that were not intended to teach languages in the first place. If that makes sense. So I think that was a big breakthrough point. And I think that much like physical adaptation for sports, there is a neuroplasticity aspect that does take time, and there are ways to compress it. But in my case with Japanese, it was like between that 6 and 8 month point where there was a real inflection point, and that's pretty much how it turned out.
Yeah, for me it was mostly a mentality shift, because I think those 6 months weren't necessarily helping me when I was learning Spanish, but something I'm sure you've written about this. One of the major issues in languages is in a traditional education, people look at a native speaker, and that's kind of the goal. And the presumption is, let's say, for example, that mastering a language 100% to sound like a native, let's say it takes 15 years. I mean, I don't know how long it takes. Let's say it takes that. Then they kind of think logically, it has to take 15 years. So to get 50% of that, you'd need 7.5 years.
Right. That's a great point. Yeah.
So what's wrong with this logic?
Well, I mean, this is like, preaching.
I know it's not logical.
So preaching to the choir, because its languages are very front loaded. But if you do an 80-20 analysis, and you know this, of course, looking at the frequency of word occurrence, then, I mean, if you just learn the letter, the word the in English, you cover a lot of ground. Now, you're not going to speak to anyone, you're just using the to drive you and them crazy, but as you add words, there is a dramatic point of diminishing returns, many points of diminishing returns. So if you wanted to get, the explanation that I sometimes give to people is, if you wanted to fool a native speaker into thinking that you are close to native or perhaps grew up there, let's say 30 days out of a 30-day calendar month, that might take 10 years. It might. Who knows? Like you said, I don't know. Maybe. But to get to the point where you can do it 29 days out of 30, I think you could do that in a year or less without too much trouble if you really apply yourself. But it's getting those final grains of salt, those final words, that really requires that huge investment, or so it would seem. But yeah, it's a good point. I think the mathematical, when you run the mental arithmetic and distribute it across 15 years, like, oh, well, if I want it to be even 50% as good, which is, in most people's minds, pretty crappy still, it would take 7.5 years. I'm not even going to try. Like, that's a waste. And, that's a good point. Never put it that way.
Yeah, because like what I found is when I'm trying to learn a language, something similar to the Pareto principle you talk about a lot, is I'm much more focused on the short term and what can I do in the short term.
Yeah.
And I think this is very, very different to traditional methods that kind of see anything less than mastery of a language as a waste of time and useless. And I mean, realistically, it'd be great if everyone thought I was a native 100% of the time. But I mean, why do I really need that? What I'm looking for is I want to have good conversations with people. I don't want there to be any misunderstandings. And I've actually reached the stage where I can pass for a native speaker in particular situations for up to 2 minutes.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of restrictions there. Like it has to be a situation I'm comfortable in, and so on. And so I can't say you're going to confuse me for a native all the time. But these are all realistic things. If you look at what you want to work on, and, people can come up with silly things like you have to be able to debate Kantian philosophy. And I'm like, I don't do that in English.
Right, exactly. That's my response.
My standards for fluency are based on what I can do in English.
Yeah.
And when people start saying, you got to be able to talk politics, I'm like, I find politics boring. If you talk to me in English about politics, I'm not going to be able to do that.
Right.
So, like, in my understanding, when I say I try to be fluent in a language, I'm aiming to be socially equivalent to how I am in English.
Yeah.
So I can follow many people speaking amongst one another.
Yeah.
I can talk to them without slowing the conversation down. It's as good as speaking to a native, even though you know that I'm not a native because I'm making a few mistakes. And for me, that's fluency. And then a little bit higher than that would be doing these things in professional context.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I've actually sat the Spanish DELE, the C2 diploma, which is the professional level. But I still think below that, it's still very, very powerful. And for me, it counts as fluency. And it's what I'm aiming for, and what I think is realistic in 3 months is this social fluency.
Yeah.
So one of the big questions people were asking me when I told them I was going to talk to you is, how do you define fluent? Because in a layman's context, it's very easy to throw these words around. I learned how to speak Spanish in so many weeks.
What does that mean?
What does that even mean?
Yeah. So I like the social equivalency explanation. I'll probably borrow that. But the example that I used, like when I was trying to, God, what was it? I think it was maybe in almost every language when you run through typical training programs for busy business people, right? It's like, all right, let's learn to read the Financial Times. And I'm like, if I grab the Financial Times on an airplane, I can't read the damn thing in English. Why am I? And I'm never going to talk about it, certainly. Anyway, that's a whole separate gripe session. So for fluency, for me personally, my marker has been, can I have, let's say, a 10, 15-minute conversation without slowing down the conversation, where I can express any idea I want to express, and if I don't understand something, immediately clarify it that the other side says. So it's really having like a 10-minute pleasant conversation where the other person would come away saying, like, Yes. Now, again, it's an ambiguous term, but in their language to another native speaker, he is fluent in Spanish, or he is fluent in fill in the blank.
Right.
In some cases, I'm aiming for something like when I was in German, I was at the Hauptschule, which is a really actually pretty good school, and I was aiming for the Mittelstufe at first, and then moving beyond that, and then when I was in Argentina, I like having concrete objective goals. I think it's helpful. Not everyone needs it, but I like to. Where with Spanish, I was aiming for the I guess it was like nivel avanzado, blah 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 blah, at the University of Buenos Aires. But just a side note, real fast, because talking about mental shift, I think part of the reason that people fail in languages is the same reason they fail at many things, like dieting. They'll think of dieting, they're like, okay, this is a permanent change forever. How do I feel? And it's overwhelming. And so with dieting, I'm like, look, it's a 2-week trial. Just do a 2-week trial. If you don't like it, you can stop. And with languages, I think, for instance, I never tackle any language thinking this is going to be a lifelong project, ever. I don't ever tackle a language thinking this is going to be a 1-year project, ever. When I tackle a language, if I go to, let's say, Turkey, and I study Turkish, I don't expect to ever use Turkish again after that trip, but because even having 20 phrases makes that trip 10 times more enjoyable, and I learn 10 times more, I'll put in the time. And that is how, you know what? Okay, so Japanese, another reason Japanese came about is I hosted an exchange student at my house with my family. And so we all learned, 5 to 10 sentences of Japanese. And we got along really well.
That's actually exactly the same reason I got into Spanish, because we hosted Spanish students in my hometown in Ireland.
Right. So for instance, when I was in Galway, this was hysterical. So when I was in Galway, I'm not sure I wrote about this. So I studied Irish.
Yeah.
And people think Japanese is hard. I would say Irish, just due to lack of materials, and also if you want to practice with anyone. It was funny because I'd meet every Irish person I would meet. They'd be like, "Oh, what are you doing here?" And I'd be like, "Oh, I'm doing hurling." They'd be like, "That's weird." And then I'd say Irish, and they'd go, "What the hell are you studying Irish for?" And you would have to go to like Spittle down in the the Geltacht.
Yeah.
And oh man, that was.
Well, you'd actually be surprised. I did read you mention this on the blog that you would consider Irish more difficult. I think in terms of materials to come across, yes, you're going to find a lot less.
Yeah.
But I know a lot of people who have actually learned it at a distance.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's necessarily, comparing it to other European languages, it's not that intimidating. And especially because we're less used to foreigners learning it. You're given way more flexibility in making mistakes.
Yeah, that's true.
And you don't necessarily have to go to Spittle. I mean, there are quite large Gaeltacht communities, especially in the northwest. It's a different dialect to the one in Galway. But don't give up. Don't give up hope on Irish just yet.
I haven't given up on Irish, but I would say. But I went there partially to study Irish, and I ended up learning hurling instead, which I fell in love with. So it was. I view learning as just an adventure, and I read a quote once. Sorry, it's in the book. In the 4-Hour Chef, I don't remember who said it, but he said, writing a novel is a lot like driving with the headlights on. You can't see your destination, but you can get there that way. And I think that learning is a lot like that. But I would also say that Irish, I think not all languages are equally hard or equally easy for all people. So it can be a very personal thing, right? So one of the pet peeves that I have maybe is when something is Romanized, but the phonetics of that language do not resemble English, I get antsy. And Irish is definitely that way. Like if you spell out, like how do you?
Another time, I got to sit down and
I know.
talk to you about this. It's not as bad as you think.
No. I'm not saying it's bad. I'm just saying like it's a very personal thing. Like for me, it's like Chinese, whatever. After Japanese, sure, I'll learn Chinese. Whereas most people are like, oh my God, it's the devil's language. I'm like, it's not that bad. Whereas, just to point out how like hysterical that is, that I'm like, Chinese, like 5,000 characters, I can do that. And then like, oh my God, like spelling Guramahagat, like, forget it, Anyway, so
I see where you're coming from, because we do very uniquely among languages I've come across. We have a lot of letters to describe very few sounds.
Right.
But it can be very intimidating. Yeah. But believe it or not, among Celtic languages, Irish is actually one of the easiest because of that.
Yeah.
I mean, Welsh is much more phonetic from what I've heard, and this introduces a whole lot of new problems. So
I believe it. I believe it.
Yeah. No, I read that you had gone into Irish. I thought that was fantastic. Okay. So just going back from what I read in the 4-Hour Chef, and of course your blog post about language learning, I think the core aspect of how you tackle a language is two things. Firstly, you would focus on the top words, like the top 100 words or the top 1,000 words, based on frequency that they appear in a conversation or in print or something. And you have a particular set of sentences that you deconstruct grammatically to help you get an overall look at the language. And you generally would apply this to any language. It helps you a lot. What would you say are how does conversation come into your learning technique?
Yeah, there are a bunch of different ways. I actually have some more show and tell, but I forgot one, so hold on a second. I'll be right back. All right, so conversation is, everything I do is with the target outcome of speaking fluently. It's not that I don't value reading and writing, and I can read and write, certainly could much better back in the day, but I can still read and write quite well in Japanese and Chinese, and studied Korean for a year or two, and I don't mention that much. But I can still read most Korean. That's a really fun one to get people over a fear of reading, because you can learn how to read Korean in about 2 hours. But I focus on, I have a particular way that I approach what the Germans call tandem, so just two-person sessions. And I would love to hear your thoughts on this, because I know you do a lot of it. But the common way that this is approached to finding a language partner is, I'll teach you English and you teach me Portuguese, and it never works. It never, in my experience, if it's that broad, it never works, because native English speakers suck at it's like Porky Pig moment, suck at teaching English. Just like people who are the best in the world at programming suck at teaching programming. It's second nature. And also true with someone who speaks your target language. So there needs to be a framework of some type. And the way that I, as an English speaker, native English speaker, I'm very unfairly given an advantage that almost everyone studies English. Not everyone, but almost everyone. So I will go to English schools and find students who are at an intermediate or advanced level, assuming that I am trying to learn their language at a basic level, ideally intermediate. And we'll come in and we will swap back and forth. So we might have like 20-minute session, 20-minute session, 20-minute session. And the first thing that we do is we will, and I have like a bunch of notes I took on this, but one of the approaches is to always review materials beforehand and then come in with specific questions. The second approach, which I borrowed from Chinese 101 at Princeton, is having and this is one of the first things I do. I don't think I've talked about this much, but I will get a bio, a self-introduction of, say, 1 page in length down on paper. So like, my little brother is this years old. He lives here. My parents do this. My blah, blah, blah. I grew up here. And it is amazing how much mileage you get out of that 1 page. Because guess what? That's the first 3 minutes of every single conversation you're going to have. And,
absolutely.
And I will, but the point is, I will have them help me, if need be, translate that or refine it, and then I will read that aloud and have them circle any phoneme or any pronunciation problems that I have, and then work on those sounds. And this is what we had to do every week in Chinese 101 at Princeton, which is, at the time, I think was the best Chinese 101 program in the entire country. It was extremely effective. We would have to go into a language lab and read out loud several different conversations. And then the professors would take time separately, identify where we had trouble, and then we would spend an entire private session going through those sounds. So the tandem very often will start off light for me, which means helping someone identify specific issues in English. And when I say identify specific English issues, it's not going to be, and I have a set of questions, I'll give you a couple of examples, but it wouldn't be, hey Tim, what's the difference between anything and something? No, that's not a good question because I'll make up an answer. I don't know the answer, right? I'm not going to give the right answer. A better answer is, which is more common, this or this? Which would you say, this or this? What are some examples of how you would use this or this? Then I can give an answer that doesn't have any speculation in it. And then very often we would go back and forth. But like the first, there are a few phrases I learned right off the bat so that I can get to biking without training wheels as early as possible. So like, what is the difference between? That is one of the first things I learned. And, you know, was ist die Unterschied zwischen, blah, 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 you know?
Yep.
And then it's, how do you pronounce this is another one, right? Or how does one say in another language? You know, wie sagt man blah, blah, blah auf Deutsch? Or whatever. And can you write it down? Some of the basics. But in the tandems, usually it's questions based on material you've reviewed already, and then once we get a little more comfortable, one of the things I like to do is practice constructions and then have to translate it yourself. So, for instance, what I would say is usually start if they want to practice, let's say the subjunctive. So they want to practice, you know, if I had $1 million, I would buy a Ferrari. Okay, fine. So I will give them a few pairs, like, okay, $1 million Ferrari, go. And then they'll say it in English. I'll correct them if need be, and then I'll have to try to translate that into, say, Spanish, right? And then we'll do the next one. Okay, boom. Like, if I had a brother, I would, I don't know, travel more, right? Boom. And then I'll have to translate it. So formatting a tandem, there is definitely, I think, a craft to formatting a tandem, so it's the most productive. The other thing that I do while I'm taking the tandem, and also when I'm reviewing materials, this is an old one. No, I don't think anyone's seen this. So these are homemade color-coded flashcards. I'm a flashcard guy, right? Some people aren't, I am. And these are broken down. I haven't looked at these in ages, but these are for German. And they're broken down by daily, weekly, and monthly review, effectively.
Yep.
So I know what I've hit consistently, I know what I haven't hit consistently, and I have timed reviews. But I will write down typically, let's see here, it's typically not single words. I will write down phrases like at the beginning. I guarantee this probably came up at the beginning of a tandem, where it's bitte bedienen Sie sich. Okay, please help yourself. All right, and I just find that your bang for the buck in terms of acquiring vocabulary and also grammar is so much faster and so much more useful when you're memorizing these phrases as opposed to just memorizing examples that you would never use. You know,
right.
Find an idiom.
No, because you're learning the new vocabulary, but you're also learning sentences in context.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
I'm also a huge fan of flashcards, and I see just the system you've got there is based repetition, because you would take a card and you would put it in the position that you know is when you're likely to just before you're likely to forget it. And I just use the app for this, Anki.
Anki's good. Super Memo's not bad either.
Yeah,
and I think Anki might actually use the one of the later algorithms from Super Memo.
Yeah, it's based on that. Yeah. And I think Memrise also has a kind of a spaced repetition system built into it.
Yep, Memrise does as well. Yeah, Ed Cook was in the 4-Hour Chef. It's really good guy, and I actually know his co-founder too, because he was initially he was in my class at one point at Princeton, the high tech entrepreneurship, and then Duolingo, which I'm an investor in, also has some mechanisms for spaced repetition, which are pretty cool. So
I actually interviewed Luis.
Oh, you did?
A few weeks back. Yeah, in Spanish.
He's a smart guy. Yeah, Luis is no joke. He's a smart dude.
Oh yeah, very smart. Had a great time asking him how he got into the whole thing.
Yeah.
And something else I wanted to ask you, like you in the 4-Hour Chef, you broke down a kanji character
Mhm.
explaining the kind of memory technique you use to learn it, which I think is very similar to James Heisig's strategy in Remember the Kanji.
It is. I mean, and he's certainly not the first person to have done it, but he did a fantastic job of putting it into a few books that give you a very high ROI on your time, because left to your own devices, I mean, it does take more time to create your own images. And there have been some pretty interesting...
Do you do that kind of stuff for like just learning Spanish or European languages, where you see a word, do you have some kind of a mental association, or is it just about you see it so many times in the flashcard that it kind of burns into your memory?
It depends on the way that I like to think of mnemonics and these memory devices is like wrapping a package before you ship it. So if it's fragile, you wrap it more. If it's not fragile at all, you don't have to put in all this extra padding and packaging. And so if something comes to me very easily, I'm not going to create a mnemonic device just to create a mnemonic device. I don't do it by default. I do it sort of just in time and not just in case, if that makes sense. But I do use mnemonics a lot. Mnemonics, and one of the benefits of tackling multiple languages, even if you're only doing multiple languages for 2 to 4 weeks at a time, and I've done a lot of languages that way. I mean, Vietnamese, Thai, I've tackled a lot of languages I never had any intention of ever using again, just during trips, is that they allow you to, you have more pegs. You have more pegs to work with. So I want to show you 2 more things, just two tricks. I don't know if they're tricks, but 2 things I found very useful. So the first is linking languages together can be very helpful. It can be confusing at times, but for instance, this book here, this is relevant to you right now. Not that you would use it, but so this is a book. So Español fácil para falar, right? So this is a book for Brazilian Portuguese speakers who want to speak Spanish. Well, guess what? If I speak Spanish, I can use this to learn Brazilian Portuguese. And it's a bit of a misnomer, but I call this reverse learning. And what I mean by that is, perhaps an easier example is this. So this is from mainland. Is this from mainland? Yeah, this is from mainland China. It's in simplified characters, and this is sort of 900 common phrases in English. The reason I like to use books intended for native speakers who are learning English is because then you know your target language is accurate. It's astonishing how many textbooks written for English speakers trying to learn Spanish or whatever have mistakes everywhere. It's amazing. And so and this is particularly valuable if, let's say, you're going to Taiwan and you're going to be spending time in Taiwan. Guess what? I mean, their Chinese is not exactly the same as mainland, so you're better off getting a book written for Taiwanese people who want to learn English.
I'm actually doing something similar here. I don't know if let's see what I got here. I am learning my Egyptian Arabic through French.
Oh, nice. Yeah, Asimil has some great stuff. Very cool.
That's why I picked it, because I've used Asimil in the past. In this case, it's not 100% useful because I'm not actually learning modern standard Arabic.
Yeah, you're learning Egyptian. Yeah.
So it's not that great, but just in general for presenting examples and so on, I'm really appreciating it. So definitely, branching and using one language to help you learn another, or doing what you're doing, the reverse, because I agree, I found so much material, and you can really feel that all they've really done is ask some translators to get these phrases for them, and there's no context. Like, the translator doesn't know what's come before, what's come after. And I could see, even as a beginner learner, I can see mistakes in the target language. And, this leads to me dismissing a lot of stuff as irrelevant, and you and I are both not exactly huge fans of that yellow box you can buy in airports. And one of the reasons is because, for me at least, is because it's all about translating the same content rather than giving it to you in a context specific for that language used by native speakers. And I don't like this translation aspect. And this is why, like, the core of me learning my language is speaking with a native speaker. I mean, I do have materials I go through, but like my top 1,000 words are generally based on conversations I've had and notes I make on those conversations. because I found some 1,000 top 1,000 lists tend to be based on newspapers and the written word, which is a lot less relevant to me as a beginning tourist and introducing myself and so on.
Yeah, there's a lot. There's a lot of crossover, but it isn't all crossover. And then, of course, there are the phrases that you hear all the time that are never going to pop up in one of those lists, like valeu, legal, whatever in Brazil. Like, you're just not going to have those in a frequency list. But I also tend to, and I know we only have a few minutes left, but I tend to separate my sort of out-of-country training and in-country training. And I know that there are a lot of really interesting workarounds, but I'll usually use the high-frequency list prior to arriving in a country where I know I'm going to focus in a really dedicated fashion on the language. So it's more of an insurance policy, not an insurance policy, a head start. Yeah, I mean, and I think that people should look at this as language learning. It's almost it's a toolkit. It's a toolkit. And so there are two questions. Number one is, what are you building? Number two, what tools are you going to use to get there? And you have to have a clear picture of both. And I really find that the 1 or 2 week trial is a fun way to get people into it. It's like, okay, look, you have a trip coming up. You're going to be in Barcelona or you're going to be in Madrid or whatever for a week. Like, how can we get you to a point where you make everybody smile and people just treat you 100 times better and you have more fun?
Yeah, people need to embrace, the lower end of language learning a little bit more, because it's got so much potential. I mean, you can get your foot in the door to start to get to more things. And I always feel disappointing when people only look at replicating a native. So I just have two final things I wanted to say before we run out of time. Firstly, just going to the 4-Hour Chef now. When I was reading about your motivation for writing it, and I was kind of, if you were going to write a book about learning, I thought maybe it would be entirely about language learning. But I like your motivation for focusing on cooking a little bit more, because if you were to write about language learning, it's something you've been doing for years, and you wouldn't really have this fresh perspective anymore. But the whole point is, in the book, you're literally starting from scratch, and you're applying your general how to learn techniques to cooking. And I think people should appreciate that sometimes what you need is not actually a language learning book, but you need to know how to learn. So you discuss a lot of things, and you do discuss language learning, but I think even when you're talking about something completely different in the book, it's the kind of philosophies people need to embrace if they are going to learn a foreign language. So I do think it is relevant to language learning, and I'd be very happy to tell people to check that out. And I can't wait to go through the rest of it myself. The real version that I can hold in my hands. So the final question I wanted to ask you then is what? So with all of this, you've learned a language in a couple of weeks, and you've learned a language to a much higher level of fluency. What's the most valuable experience that you've had from all this? What's the craziest or the most fun thing that speaking a non-English language has opened up to you?
Oh man, there's.
I know there are a million things.
I mean, my life. I'll just say this: with just English, my life would be. And this is obviously very subjective, but I mean, 20% of the richness that I've had. It's incredible, the impact that languages have had. And when I say that, I don't mean the ones that I'm necessarily fluent in. At all. I mean, knowing 10 words of Indonesian and basically getting adopted by an Indonesian family that is not in Indonesia, or learning just enough Arabic to communicate with a baker across the street from me in Berlin when I was there, just enough to order a little bit of food and say thank you. I mean, the impact that had on my daily relationship with this guy. But I'll just give an unusual example, and I want to just underscore something you said, which is, the 4-Hour Chef is used in the sense of like jefe, sort of being a director in your life, a boss as opposed to a spectator, and the recipe of the book is meta learning. So it's looking at how there are sections on language learning, sections on sports, sections on everything, and cooking is kind of used like Zen in the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance uses motorcycles. But one of the oddest maybe examples I have was tackling Japanese horseback archery in Nikko, Japan, and it would have been impossible without Japanese. Absolutely, completely impossible. And the reason that example, there's so many I could bring up, but one of the reasons I like that example is that, again, personal opinion, but I think that Japanese are called xenophobic all the time, very unfairly, because they're extremely self-conscious of their English. Because they lost the phoneme lottery. Like, when God was giving out sounds, they just got kind of screwed. They don't have many. So that's why they sound so funny when they speak other languages. And because they do this kind of thing when someone tries to speak them in English, doesn't make them xenophobic. And if you look at what has happened to me speaking Japanese, and it's not just true for white people either. Look at Kazumoto on Twitter.
Yeah.
They're so open and so generous, and I think people in general are when you make the effort. So learning Japanese horseback archery in Nikko, I think I was maybe the first foreigner, or maybe second, ever to train with the, what was the name? Ogasawara Ryu family, where they have these jackets. It's great. It says like Ogasawara Ryu Yabusame since 1147.
Wow.
And I think I was the first, if not the first, then maybe the second in like 50 years to train with them. And it's something I'll always remember. It's something I'll always remember. Something I'll tell my kids about. Something I'll tell my grandkids about. And it all came initially from comic books and judo textbooks.
Yeah.
And I think that'd be that's a standout example.
Yeah. So that's great. I've really loved talking to you, and I'm looking forward to reading the rest of your book, and I hope other people will check it out. And I think I'm able to give away 10 copies, if I'm right. People, I'm going to say that what I want to hear in the comments, either here on YouTube or on the blog post, is what the most valuable experience other people have had. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to take my 10 favorite ones and send them a copy of your book. And then if they don't see that by Monday, they should go out and get one themselves. Yeah,
and if people want samples, sample chapters, table of contents, the video trailer is pretty fun. It's the most viewed nonfiction book trailer of all time now. Just go to 4 Hours Chef, and you can get pretty good taste for what's in there as well. So, yeah, thanks for having me, man. This has been a long time coming, so I appreciate you taking the time.
No, thank you for taking the time, and I'm sure I'll run into you somewhere around the world.
Absolutely. Yeah, go to Mahagat.
Right. Maihu. Great job. All right, cheers.